If you've been watching my channel recently, you'll know that I just lifted my 2016 Toyota Tacoma TRD off-road. And in this video, I wanted to explain a little bit of how the installation went. Actually did a self-installation with a friend, have no experience doing lift kits or really dealing with suspension at all. And so it was a completely new process for me. Wanted to share a little bit about that experience, talk about some of the challenges and information that we gained along the way, and give you some input if you're also a novice mechanic looking at doing the installation yourself, what you might expect, and whether or not it's something you'd want to attempt on your own. Now, I did mention I did it with another friend. He's a lot more mechanically inclined than me. That made a huge difference during the process to just have somebody that knew what they were doing. It sped things along. He also happened to have a lot of the tools that we needed, which was really helpful. It would have complicated things quite a bit had I done it on my own. And it was also just really nice having a second set of hands and somebody that you know, you can kind of keep motivated together as you encounter frustrated pieces. And so want to talk a little bit about the installation, give you some feedback in case you're thinking about doing an installation yourself. Now, the kit that I went with is a 2-inch rough country spacer in the front and a 1-inch Toytec spacer in the rear. And the reason that I landed on this kit is that my reason for doing a lift kit was purely for appearances. I wasn't really looking at improving the off-road capability, and at the same time I wanted to do it on a budget, wanted to maintain the gas mileage as much as possible, wanted to maintain the ride quality and handling, and just make a really subtle change in the appearance. And with this kit, I think I've really accomplished that. I'm really pleased with how it turned out, you know, especially trying to do it on a budget. I was able to buy the kit, $60 for the spacer in the front, $100 for the block in the rear. Very reasonable, especially since we did the installation ourselves. So just gonna start up at the front, give you a little bit of input into how the process went, and then we'll jump to the rear. So starting up here in the front, basically what we've got is a shock assembly with the Bilstein shock in here, factory coil spring on the outside, and then you can see up here at the top this silver piece. That is the new spacer that we installed. And so basically, to install the spacer, what you're trying to accomplish is to remove this entire shock assembly from the vehicle, and once you've got it removed, you attach this spacer to the top of it and then reinstall it. So it's a pretty simple installation. Basically, all you're doing is moving the whole shock and spring assembly down 2 inches to add that additional little bit of height, and then you've basically just got this piece up here at the top that's adding the lift. So it's a pretty simple kit overall, but to get there, there's some challenges. You have to move several objects, and so as you can see, we've got some conflicts here. You've got this guy's in the way, this guy, and to get it out, you basically need to remove the whole shock assembly, go in this direction. Now, I mentioned I'm not real mechanically inclined, so you'll have to excuse me as we go through some of the technicalities here, but that's exactly why I'm making this video, is I want to really talk from a novice perspective. If you're looking at doing a lift on your own, give you an idea of what to expect and whether it's maybe something that you can handle or not. So, I believe this is called the control arm. This is for the steering. You can see that it pushes out and back to move the entire assembly right here. So this whole apparatus right here needs to be disconnected in order to get the control arm out of the way. You've got a little clip in here, and this guy's got to come off. This guy right here, this was one of the unusual steps for me. I don't know what this is called, but it's basically a large washer that is compressed onto the bolt, and in order to relieve that pressure, you've got to hit it with a hammer. And to me, that was really unusual. Luckily, my friend, again, as I mentioned, is more mechanically inclined, and he was you know, familiar with this and comfortable with hitting it with a hammer. To me, it seemed like, you know, that's what you do when you're angry or frustrated and you're working in the garage, not when you're actually trying to get something done. But anyway, you basically hit this guy until it just breaks loose. And then when you reattach it, you just screw it on like any other washer or, sorry, nut. And as you're putting the nut on, it sets into place and compresses as needed. So the trick getting it off is just that you've got to hit this guy with a hammer to remove it. So that's to get the control arm out of the way. Now, one of the steps that we kind of messed up had we followed the directions to a T, it recommends removing the driver and passenger side at the same time. We thought it would be easier to just start on the driver's side, do that. When we're done, jump over to the passenger side. The issue with that is that you've got this bar right here, which is the sway bar, that in order to get it out of the way, it's got to be detached on both sides of the vehicle so that it can swing up. And so in order to get the sway bar detached, you've got to do it on both sides. So you're moving on this side, then the other side, and the whole thing will swing up out of the way, and it gives you that clearance that you need to get the assembly out. Now, so those are the first two items that need to be removed. And then the third is right up here, this attachment here. You've got to basically detach this entire brake assembly from this piece. I should know what this is called, but I don't. And so this clip comes out, and then you unscrew that that nut. And as you're doing that, this entire apparatus will basically just drop down when you get it loose. And so that was one of the tricks, is we had to support the weight of this because there's several wires back here, and then also the differential, the front differential is attached, and if you allow it to just swing down and drop, it could pull the differential out, and it could tear the CV joints. And so it's really important that you support this weight. So what we did is just put a jack right under these bolts to kind of support that weight once we had this side undone. And this is one of the steps where it was really nice having two people, because then when we were ready to remove the shock assembly and we needed to get the jack out of the way, you could have one person just kind of support the weight of this while the other's pulling the shock assembly out. Now the shock assembly itself, once you get all those conflicts out of the way, it's fairly simple. You can see that you've got another nut down here, basically one bolt going through the bottom there that's got to be removed, and then up on top you've got these two in the front, and then there's one in the rear. So you basically just remove those three, remove the whole shock assembly, you install the spacer on the top. The installation of that's pretty simple. There's basically these three bolts inside that attach on there. And then the one trick is the bolts that are coming out of the stock assembly here are actually too long for the 2-inch spacer. If you went with a 3-inch spacer, you'd be fine, but with the 2-inch, they actually stick up just a little bit higher than the spacer, and so those we had to cut off. So that's one thing you'll want to keep in mind if you do the 2-inch spacer, is that you've got to cut the top of those bolts off so that you can fit this in flush with the or when you reinstall it. So those guys have to be cut off. But other than that, it was a pretty simple installation. So we had to cut those. All the torque measurements were provided in the manual, so it's pretty simple overall. Once we kind of figured things out, and was a pretty smooth process. I'm thinking back on it, I think it took us about 2 to 3 hours to do the spacers on both sides of the vehicle. Again, with one very novice mechanic, and then one mechanic that's, I'd say, an intermediate mechanic. So pretty smooth process overall. Had I been doing it on my own, I'm guessing that just doing the front of the vehicle probably would have taken me 6 hours. And so it was really nice to have someone that knew what they were doing. And then also just having all those tools was really key. Now, when we were doing the installation, one thing that was really key was finding a good set of instructions. So the instructions that come with the rough country spacer are not very good. Unless you are really mechanically inclined and you know what all these parts are, and then also, yeah, I don't know, they weren't that good. And so what I did was I basically used the instructions that were provided from rough country in conjunction with Low Range Off-Road has a 3-1 kit that I looked at pretty seriously when I did this installation. Decided I didn't want to go with the 3-1 because I didn't want to have any sagging in the rear. And but anyway, their instructions were really good on their website. They had really high quality photos. And so, but the installation was a little different. I mentioned the differential drop being one piece, and then also by doing 3 inches, it has some other impacts. And so I basically used the Low Range Off-Road pictures and instructions in conjunction with what I had from rough country to make sure I was really clear on what needed to be done. And it made the process a lot smoother. So I really recommend, if you're gonna do a spacer and you're not doing the Low Range Off-Road spacer, that you at least look at their instructions, because they're awesome instructions. And it's probably a kit that's worth considering also. So that's the front of the vehicle. We'll jump to the rear and give another explanation back there on how that went. So mechanically speaking, doing the lift rear was actually probably easier, but it ended up taking us the same to maybe even longer than doing the front. But it's pretty simple installation, really. You basically, the trickiest part is just getting jacks set up around the vehicle to support the weight of the vehicle. But what you've got here is, these are the factory leaf springs, and then the axle, and you can see spliced just between those, or sandwiched right between them, we've got the new Toytec block that goes in there. And so these U-bolts are new as well. But basically what you're doing, in order to get that block in there, this assembly down here is also original to the truck. So basically you just have these three pieces plus new bolts on the bottom for the installation. And so you remove the factory U-bolts and bolts, or sorry, nuts on the bottom. Lift up or drop the axle down slowly, so you have to get another axle or another jack underneath the axle, and then you've also got jacks supporting the vehicle. And then you get just a little gap in there, you insert the spacer, and then you put the new U-bolts on. The new U-bolts are pretty long underneath here, and so sticking down from the bottom here, you have to cut those off. And so that was another thing where you've got to have a tool that you could use to cut those off once you have the installation done. Also important is you want to make sure that when you're screwing these in, that you get an even length on both the front and the rear, as well as both sides here. So there's a little bit of being careful when you're putting those nuts on, that you're doing a nice even pattern to get that installation done. And that was pretty much it. So mechanically, it's pretty easy getting that in there. The real trick is just figuring out how to do the jacks for the rear axle, and then also for the vehicle, in order to create that space so you can get the block in there. So pretty easy installation overall, but you know, logistically ended up taking us just as long to figure out the whole situation with the jacks. Now, another thing that's really important to think about when you're doing the rear is the more jacks you have, the better. So if you have access to, you know, 3 floor jacks, it's probably going to be ideal. You also want to have a lot of jack stands when you're doing both the front and rear installation, just because there's so many, you know, if you're removing both the front and rear, and then you've got the axle and everything, it's just nice to be able to have that backup of using the floor jacks, but then also having jack stands available. And then also secondary jack stands aren't a bad idea either. So, you know, when you're doing this rear portion of the vehicle, it's sticking back pretty far from any nearest front point. So we had a jack stand, or I think actually we ended up with a floor jack under the rear hitch, just as a secondary precaution to make sure that we're safe as we're doing the installation. You know, you're wrenching on a lot of items when you're doing this work, and you'd hate to knock the vehicle off the jack stand. And so just really important to be careful as you're doing the installation. And that was really, you know, one of the things that slowed us down too, is we were being very cautious as we were doing everything to make sure that we were being careful and safe, just to, you know, avoid any injury. So to summarize on the installation, if you're a complete beginner, it's probably gonna be a really frustrating install, but it could probably be done. You're gonna be better off though if you at least have a second set of hands, and if you've got a friend that's a little more mechanically inclined, I would recommend trying to get somebody else to kind of help you through the process, work through it with you, and it's probably gonna be a lot smoother, and it's gonna be a lot safer. But it would be possible to do as a novice, I think, as long as you're willing to put up with some frustration and a little bit of a learning curve. Now, a few tips to make the process go as smooth as possible. Really figure out what tools you're gonna need ahead of time. Figure out what sizes you're gonna need and lay those out. Just makes the process a lot smoother if you have everything available and ready to go as you're doing the install. Watch a few installations before you do it on YouTube. Look through various instruction manuals. Try to really get as best of an idea as possible of what you're going to be encountering as you go through the install. It's going to make it a lot smoother, so that when you hit those roadblocks, you know what to do and they don't come as a huge surprise. I mentioned that the Low Range Off-Road website, they've got a really good instructional manual with their 3-1 kit. Definitely would recommend looking at that if you're going to be doing a leveling kit. And then they've also got a video on YouTube that's really good So those two in tandem, I definitely recommend looking at those in advance and then printing out the instructions or having your computer handy as you're doing the install so that you can really check things off as you go and make sure that you're getting each step. One of the really nice things about the low range off-road manual is that it's almost too thorough, which with an instructional manual where you're dealing with the suspension, handling, stability of your vehicle, I think it's really important to make sure that you are following every step. They've got really good pictures indicating what object you're removing, and it's very thorough. They don't miss a single step, and so definitely recommend that you look through those, get an idea of what you're going to be encountering before you do encounter it. If you have any general comments or questions, leave them in the section below and I can do my best to try to answer them. For more videos on the 2016 Tacoma, subscribe to my channel. In the meantime, thanks for watching.